My name is Mel Spiegelman. I'm President and CEO of the Global Alliance for TB Drug Development, which, as many of you know, is a nonprofit organization whose mission it is to develop and deliver affordable and more effective TB treatments. And clearly, we are extremely proud to be a member of this initiative. So the first question that I just want to address very quickly is, why are we doing this? And tuberculosis, as I think most of the people in this room know, is an epidemic that's really of global proportions and one of humanity's oldest. And despite efforts around the globe to eradicate TB, there probably are more cases of TB today than ever before. But like many other diseases, TB has to be treated with combinations of drugs, or what we call regimens. And that's both to enhance the efficacy, but also to prevent the development of resistance, which is a well-known phenomenon with TB treatment. And the current treatments for active TB, unfortunately, are more than 40 years old. They have to be taken for too long a period of time. They're complex, they have multiple side effects, and frequently they interact with antiviral drugs, which, as many of you know, is really problematic since TB is the leading cause of death among AIDS patients. So that's a frequent issue of being able to treat both simultaneously. And if anything, when one looks at the difficult treatment options for drug-sensitive TB, what's happened is that's helped fuel the rise of epidemic of drug-resistant TB. And the issues of treatment duration, of cost, of complexity, of tolerability, of efficacy, they're even multifold worse in the world of drug-resistant TB than in drug-sensitive TB. And with drug-resistant TB now reaching practically every corner of the world, clearly we need more than a new drug to eradicate TB, or to help in that eradication. We need entirely new regimens of active TB drugs. So that's why we're here today, is in fact to celebrate the launch of this critical path for new TB regimens, CPTR. And this is an initiative that really could revolutionize the way that TB treatments are developed by dramatically shortening the time to do this from actually decades to years. And it really forges a new way of thinking, actually, about TB drug development, focusing on testing combinations of new drugs early in the clinical development process and holding the promise of really bringing these significantly improved treatments, not just marginally improved treatments, but significantly improved treatments to all patients much, much sooner than could otherwise be envisioned. But to realize this paradigm really shift requires a truly diverse set of groups coming together to overcome the challenges that this initiative calls for. And today's launch is really the global announcement of the realization of that commitment of having all of these multiple groups coming together. We're certainly fortunate to have the support of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, which will play a critical role advancing the regulatory science and shaping the pathway for the successful development of the CPTR initiative. And we're especially fortunate to have the FDA Commissionr, Margaret Hamburg, here to help launch the initiative. Of Dr. Hamburg's many accomplishments and illustrious career, I'm just going to highlight one, and partially because I'm from New York for the last couple of decades. And as many of you know, Dr. Hamburg was the commissioner, New York City Health Commissioner in the early 1990s during the spread of the drug-resistant TB epidemic in New York. And she led an extremely successful, progressive, innovative response that really averted a public health disaster while she was serving in that role in New York. But the outbreak still cost the city of New York, at least the numbers that are bantered, about $1 billion to control it. And at that time, Dr. Hamburg had really decades-old drugs that she could work with to handle the outbreak. But the realization is today, 20 years later, if faced with a similar crisis, the situation has changed preciously little. And someone in that situation would still have pretty much the same tools that Dr. Hamburg had and that her predecessor might have had 20 years before her. So what we have now is confronted, if somebody were confronted with an imminent crisis, that would be the situation. So the need for and the potential of this initiative really can't be overestimated. So with that, my pleasure to introduce Dr. Margaret Hamburg, Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration.
Well, thank you very much, and it really is a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate your generous introduction. I am sorry I'm not going to be able to stay for the whole program. It was definitely originally on my schedule, but Secretary Sebelius, my boss and the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, asked me to join her at another kickoff event just moments from now. So I did want to be here because this is so exciting and so important, but forgive me for running off. Part of my job as Commissioner of the FDA is to give a lot of speeches and opening remarks, et cetera. Today, unfortunately, I have 4 of them. But normally, they don't have quite the same personal power and impact that this one today really does. This, as you heard, really has personal meaning for me, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, if even briefly. I wish I didn't have to be here. We are here because every year, nearly 2 million people worldwide die of a disease that we learned to cure more than half a century ago. We're here because many of today's patients have developed resistance to those decades-old drugs, and these new strains pose a new and larger threat to us all. We're here because the science of this disease has been stagnant for too many years, and we still use a primitive diagnostic and a dizzyingly complex regimen that makes treatment and compliance difficult. Very early in my tenure as New York City Health Commissioner in the early 1990s, as you heard, I was grappling with an epidemic of resurgent tuberculosis. As I strove to get quickly up to speed about the issues, I remember talking with a TB researcher who wistfully observed to me that he thought that TB was the only field of medicine where you could have gone into hibernation for decades, literally decades, and awake to find that the field had not changed. His words were true then, and sadly, they're still too true today. I was appointed commissioner in New York City in 1991. The next year marked the highest reported TB case rate in almost 3 decades in New York City. The nearly 4,000 cases that were reported that year represented a 152% increase over 1980, just about 1 decade. It was not an easy time to assume office. The number of TB cases had been mounting in New York City throughout the 1980s, but for reasons that still kind of baffle me, it had been largely ignored. It was fueled by poverty, homelessness, AIDS, and the erosion of the public health infrastructure. Even then, as you know, the disease was in fact treatable and curable. Yet it reached epidemic proportions, and it reached those proportions this time in a form that included a large percentage of drug-resistant cases that were much, much harder to control and treat. We quickly mobilized to put together a comprehensive approach, investing significant energy and resources to assure appropriate treatment, including the implementation of directly observed therapy, increasing the number of patients receiving DOTS from 100 in 1988 to 1,300 in 1993, and increasing screening, monitoring, and isolation capacity in hospitals, shelters, and other congregate facilities. Eventually, thanks to a well-designed program, adequate resources, and real political and programmatic commitment from the mayor and others at high levels throughout the city, we were able to turn the epidemic around in New York City. And I just have to correct that billion number. It's one of the published numbers that people don't read carefully enough, and you're not the only one. It was actually, we put a lot of money into this program, and it was money well spent, but the $1 billion was what we could have prevented in additional costs if we had managed TB appropriately in the first place. So I think it's an important number to acknowledge, but it actually is a number that I think compels action rather than what happens sometimes is overwhelms people that don't have those resources to apply to the problem of TB. But with this program, between 1992 and 1997, the number of TB cases in the city dropped by almost 46%. And for the most drug-resistant strains, the drop was 86%. So even we were surprised by how much our efforts mattered. It was quite an accomplishment, and I'm still very proud of how the health department and the city of New York responded to this epidemic. We were fortunate, and it shows what can be done. And while the situation overall has very significantly improved here in the United States, the global tuberculosis crisis today is far, far from resolved. The fact is that we are still not harnessing all that science and technology can offer. The state of TB is already devastating and getting worse, and millions in the developing world are paying most dearly. And it is now more important than ever that policymakers and the public really understand what's at stake here, so that the urgency of taking meaningful action can be sustained. The real reason we're here today is because everyone in this room is dedicated to fighting this disease. We all agree we need better, more effective treatments, innovative combination therapies with shorter duration regimens that are not just effective, but that are manageable for patients around the world. And to do this quickly, we must simultaneously develop new regulatory processes that test drugs in combination earlier on so that these solutions are not dozens of years away, but hopefully only a few. So it is time for us to emerge from hibernation, to advance TB innovation and develop regulatory processes that can deliver innovation more quickly to the people who need it most. We, as the FDA, want to be a gateway, not a barrier, linking scientific opportunity to unmet public health need. You're all here today because you're taking action by developing what I'm hopeful will be an effective solution to this devastating problem. I applaud all the partners involved in this initiative, my friends from industry, from civil society, from academia, and from the advocacy community, for taking a risk and being innovative against a disease that has eluded us for far too long. So good luck to you all. Thank you for your efforts. It has been a pleasure to drop in, even briefly, and I look forward to our continuing work together to address this important public health problem and many other pressing needs before us. So thank you, and I'm just going to take off.